Hey, Dodger Game viewers. It is today, whatever that may be. What day is it, for goodness sakes? It's Friday, June 14th. And this is going to be about anti-Mormonism enthusiasts winning the rumble in the comments section. And so I jumped in the fray here, where a fellow named Steve Garrison was defending the church and left himself open a little bit too far in his claims of me being dishonest. After I jumped in late in the game here, while Rice, Panday, and Nigel, the hooligan in the house, were wiping the floor up with this guy, Steve Garrison. So I'd like to make a video and go into these comments because they both made such great comments, but I'm going to be just kind of selfish and show where I defended myself against his claims of dishonesty, which were very specific. There were a number of issues being discussed here, where the typical apologetic tack was being taken of trying to find some little error and then discrediting the anti-Mormonism enthusiast, the Mormon truther, as I like to call us. Okay. Always looking for a technicality, but Steve Garrison calls me out and says I'm a liar, and very specifically sets himself up. Too bad, Steve. Too bad. And I just want to say that Rice and Nigel the hooligan in the house, just really were super scholarly here. All right. Okay, so it's Nigel kind of arguing here with Steve Garrison regarding the missionary discussions and the format and so forth here. Says Steve, Nigel, actually they teach you how to teach. We were told explicitly not to use the text in the discussions verbatim. The only ones who did that were the lazy ones. You never bothered to read. You looked at the pictures. Then you wondered why you couldn't get your answers. Well, Steve's just kind of showing that he's a little younger and doesn't realize Jesus changed his mind, and then he was confident enough that he mouthed off when he shouldn't have. So I jumped in here and I said, you must have been serving the corporate monster after Jesus changed his mind again, because there was a time when we had to memorize the discussions verbatim. I know it because I did it at least successfully for a portion or portions. What really could get embarrassing is when you forgot to change out people's names for Mr. Brown, which was part of the written verbatim standard discussions. Now, Steve Garrison says, and now I know you're a liar. The 6 discussions never used a Mr. Brown in any of the texts. The fact that you are an ignorant tool and couldn't tell the difference between doctrine and tradition is not a technicality. It is your own ignorance. No one is responsible for your laziness and ignorance other than you. The fact that you always assume that Joseph claimed Cumorah as the spot of the last battle is your fault, and yours alone. I had responded saying, well, if that's what people are getting out of things without Joseph Smith actually defining that, then he's still guilty by default by not correcting them, because that's what a prophet's supposed to do. But about the Mr. Brown never existed in Mormon discussions. That's where I'm going to have a little fun here at the expense of Steve Garrison. Okay. All right. I respond. Let's see if I can name a few of them. After he says Mr. Brown is never mentioned. I guess he assumes that the discussions have been unchanging like the endowment was supposed to be. Let's see if I can name a few of them. I think I can get it at least to 7. Perhaps we were at different time periods, bro. Oh, do you seriously think I'd try to make shit up? People that know me know that I'm very honest. We started off with the C discussion. At least that's what we did when I recall teaching, which was basically the Joseph Smith first vision story. You know, the one he made up in 1838 and published in 1842, which contradicted history. Next was the D discussion, which was the plan of salvation. You know, like man's search for happiness. Where did we come from? Why are we here? And where are we going after death? Often accompanied by that film. Or if we traveled lightly, a film strip with a cassette recorder to go along with it. Those of you who may be millennials may not even know what a cassette recorder is. Anyway, at least it wasn't an 8-track, right? With a film strip with a cassette recorder to go along with it. And yes, brother, Mr. Brown was definitely written into the text, which went along with the flip charts. The E discussion was about prophets and priesthood, teaching a themed entry line that God had always worked through prophets, like it says in Amos chapter 3, stating that surely the Lord will do nothing save he revealeth his secret unto his servants, the prophets. The F discussion was called Truth and Error versus Error. I believe the H discussion may have been focusing on what we were taught or certain behavioral control stuff, basically mechanisms built into Mormonism that we call the law of chastity, the word of wisdom, and tithing as pillars of temple worthiness. The I discussion was about Jesus Christ. I believe that the J discussion was a preparation for baptism discussion, although it may have included those 3 principles I mentioned for the H. In other words, I'm a little shaky on exactly, between the H and the J in my mind. I think that I got that right. Okay, but yeah, one of them was like, probably preparing for baptism by realizing you got to pay tithing and obey those other 2 behavioral control mechanisms used to help mind control you that I just mentioned. Okay, so I believe I remember having 8 discussions, although I've only named 7, and I don't really remember one called G. That's pretty much what I'm saying there. I guarantee you, though, bro, Mr. Brown was part of the script. We had to ask them questions, and we were practicing our verbatim memorized discussions. So, the main point of this, Brown is evidence that I know what I'm talking about, which I mentioned. And I'm backing up what Nigel the hooligan in the house, I believe, was arguing with him, which is that we did have to memorize, and this guy's saying, no, there was never any memorization. Yeah, that's something they do differently now. Preach my gospel is not about memorization. It's about kids thinking that they're guided by the Spirit as they do what we called discussions back then. Discussions. They were sales presentations. This is a little more accurate. Okay. Brown was part of the script. We had to ask them questions. Oh, by the way, I'm going to prove this. And we were practicing our verbatim memorized discussions by addressing them to Mr. and sometimes also Mrs. Brown. As a matter of fact, when my girlfriend, who became my first wife, was taking the missionary discussions, the first one being the restoration discussion, it's kind of an apostasy in restoration, actually. The C, I misspelled that. The C discussion is what we called it. The owner did such a fine job of quoting, the missionary did such a fine job of of quoting of Joseph Smith's so-called history, with his first vision account, that she, my fiance at the time, actually asked him if that really happened to him. That was pretty funny, actually. I can still remember that. Anyway, no, he just was quoting the story so perfectly in the first person, as it is written in the Pearl of Great Price, that she thought he was telling a story. So this guy did a great job. And I still remember his name. This elder, who hailed from Silver Spring, Maryland, where I had attended the first grade, by the way, while my parents were getting divorced and lived with my grandparents, he and his companions came back to be my guides through the temple. You get a guide. I got 2 guides. This particular guy actually knew the mission president at that time, who had been his stake president, I think. Maybe his bishop, too. Anyway, those guys came, and something I vividly remember. Okay, now I tell Steve, try checking what was being taught 1980 to 82. After you discover Mr. Brown, you may apologize. Says Steve, absolutely you're a liar. What you described bears no likeness in any way to the discussions that have been used for the last 30 years. Steve's not very good at math. I respond, get a calculator, bro. That's 39 years ago, 3rd grade math. I continue. So when you figure out that 39 years ago we did have Mr. Brown in the discussions, are you going to apologize? A good friend of mine, a surfing buddy, who I have surfed in 3 different countries with, happens to be it says mission, I meant to say bishop, voice-to-text issues, a bishop right now. And we had breakfast together recently because he's not an asshole like his God and has not obeyed the church and shunned me. Anyway, he probably served about 1 year before me. I'm starting to wonder if he either remembers or has his old discussions, which he undoubtedly worked on memorizing as well. I might be putting him on the spot to ask if he'd like to settle this, but I'm wanting to wake him up anyway. I did not bring up anything in particular while we ate, since I wanted to just enjoy our friendship, as we had not seen each other in several years, though I did respond to something. It was how I met the girl that is now 752 miles away or so. In response to something he did say, I responded saying, do you know what I do on YouTube? And he said, I imagine you would like to take down the church. Okay, says Steve, I wrote my comment about 30 years before your comment about the 80s came through. If true, you are even older than I thought. Okay, is that a crime? But you are also inherently dishonest. I'm not giving you the benefit of any doubt, since you haven't been able to describe what the missionaries called those discussions. We called them discussions. As for Smith, you assume he knew where the last battle happened in the first place. He never claimed to have any such thing revealed. And at this point, it was never revealed and never taught. The lazy and ignorant made all that kind of wild assumptions, and then ran with it, just like you. As for Zarahemla, you again showing your ignorance and laziness. Joseph was told by revelation to build a settlement across Nauvoo and call it Zarahemla. He was never told it was the Zarahemla from the Book of Mormon. I say, "Sir, regarding the Zarahemla issue, I clearly stated that I was working with an impression from memory, and if you want to call it lazy, that I did not first go and research the quote before responding in this conversation. You may do as you please. You are not going to prove me intentionally dishonest, because it is not the case, and you will need to apologize to me in order to maintain any semblance of integrity on your part when we show that Mr. Brown actually is part of what I had to memorize, and then recite as nearly as perfectly as possible, not like they do today, supposedly teaching by the Spirit. No, we had the Spirit to help us memorize things verbatim, or as close to it as we could possibly perform. Now, back to your accusation of being lazy, to which I could take offense, since I would have to estimate that I spent nearly between 18 and 19 hours a day on average for the first year of putting the videos together for this channel. I was able to do that because I had zero life and was trying to recover from a nervous breakdown and doing absolutely nothing else. You certainly have no right to call me lazy. I worked very hard to support my 6 children and my wife's 3 children, and to teach them what I believe to be in the gospel of Jesus Christ, having the power to bind us together for time and all eternity. If I could just get all those individuals to obey, then we could be together forever. I lived under a tremendous amount of stress from the very beginning with a difficult wife whom I believed to represent what Lehi stated in the Book of Mormon as being opposition in all things, along with following the direction of President Spencer Woolley Kimball and having as many children as quickly as humanly possible, which is my paraphrasing of what he stated in his John and Mary essay, which he put into this book called Marriage, as well as Faith Precedes the Miracle, the former book being what I received as a wedding gift, or should I say we received and I read, as well as reading Faith Precedes the Miracle and Miracle of Forgiveness by President Kimball. I also was asked to pay a building fund in addition to tithing, fast offering, and suggestions to contribute to the welfare fund and the missionary fund if possible. Building fund, however, was what I would call nearly mandatory and required of those who are faithfully seeking their election to be made sure, such as I was, to give until it hurt like the widow's mite, rather than save for a down payment on a home for my family. I then state, I definitely have LDS Temple recommend holding friends who would disagree with you in respect to you calling me dishonest. Okay, so now the fun part. I used Google. Yes, and look what I found. This will teach us a little bit about the evolution of the missionary discussions. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this is where it's from. The New Missionary Discussions and the Future of Correlation by John Charles Duffy. This is found in, I think it's in Dialogue. It's in Sunstone. New developments in missionary teaching offer a window unto further reaching developments, Can you tell I'm struggling to read this? In church discourse and administration. They serve as a starting point for identifying ongoing trends in the church's attempt to define, quote, the gospel and manage diversity. Okay, so I'm going to go down to like the second page, I believe, is where we get to the fact that I was right. That's the exciting part here. So I was like, all right, I know I can find this shit somewhere, okay? Okay. All right. Or let's see where. Church leaders have therefore, no doubt with mixed success, through standardized missionary discussions and training materials, such standardization affects not only investigators and new members, it can also influence what missionaries and other long-term church members understand as constituting Orthodox LDS belief and practice. In this regard, it is noteworthy that church leaders have promoted Preach My Gospel for use not only by missionaries but also by parents teaching their children in presidency meetings, ward councils, and so on. The church's control over its members' understanding of orthodoxy is hardly absolute, but correlated missionary materials are potentially powerful means of inculcating orthodoxy in new and long-time members alike. My analysis of Preach My Gospel considers both the content and the mechanism of correlation. In examining the content of correlation, I will ask, what is the discourse that the church currently promotes as Orthodox gospel teaching, and how does that discourse compare to previous standardized missionary lessons, especially the 1986 discussions? In examining the mechanism of correlation, I will ask, how does the much-touted flexibility of the new missionary lesson relate to church leaders' larger efforts to establish a particular kind of relationship between uniformity and diversity in an increasingly international church? So we're noting that the Preach My Gospel methodology is different in its flexibility. Yeah, it's different from shit you memorized earlier on. We're getting to that. Prior to the 1950s, there was no church-wide system of missionary lessons. Though individual mission presidents might create lesson series of their own, LeGrand Richards' extremely popular book, A Marvelous Work and a Wonder, began as one such series. The so-called Anderson Plan, created in the late 40s by missionary Richard L. Anderson, later a professor at BYU's religion department, was another popular popular pre-standardized system. Reputedly, 11,000 copies of Anderson's plan were made in response to requests from missionaries around the world. Early teaching plans typically called for extended meetings with investigators. The Anderson plan contained 28 discussion topics, while LeGrand Richards expected investigators to receive weekly discussions for at least 6 months before baptism. Wow. So much for soccer baptisms in Nicaragua and Guatemala. The first set of missionary lessons to come from church headquarters, a systematic, this is an official name, I guess, a systematic program for teaching the gospel, was created in 1952 under the direction of Gordon B. Hinckley. B as in Bittner. Just showing off. Though, God, I'm such an asshole. Though published by the church, a systematic program was designated for optional use. The program consisted of only 7 lessons, a dramatic reduction from previous plans. The lesson took the form of Socratic dialogues between missionaries and a hypothetical investigator named Mr. Brady. Don't lose hope, people. I'm still right. I've already read this shit. The lesson relied heavily on logic and scriptural proof texts and dialogues. The dialogues had a tendency to be patronizing and manipulative. No shit. Continuing on, I had a little memory issue there. Computer, well, whatever, phone computer. Okay. The 1961 discussions were superseded. Oh, maybe that's not where I was. In 1961, the same year of the creation of the Correlation Committee, Hinckley, then assistant to the 12, unveiled a uniform system for teaching investigators. Hello, what did I do here? These were the first missionary discussions intended for mandatory church-wide use. They were also the first to be called discussions, rather than a series of dialogues with the investigator, now named Mr. Brown. Thank you. Who was led via question and answer into agreement. Led via question and answer into agreement. Yeah, it's called sales techniques. With a series of numbered questions, flannel board images provided a visual supplement to the spoken presentation. The 1961 discussions were superseded in 1973 by the Uniform System for Teaching Families. These discussions, 7 in all. Okay, so it states 7 instead of what I was remembering or thinking were 8, though I said I could only come up with 7, so I hit it on the head. Okay, although I had thought I remembered 8, I came up with 7 when I was responding to Steve there. So, somebody's being vindicated heavily here. Feeling good. These discussions, 7 in all, were printed in a 2-column format. The right-hand page contained the missionaries' presentation, while the facing left-hand page contained aids for teaching, such as suggested scriptures and ideas for responding to potential investigator questions. As in previous discussions, the missionaries posed questions to Mr. Brown. Let's make that really big for Steve. Mr. Brown. But his responses were not spelled out, as they had been in the 1952 and 1961 discussions, and the questions posed were more open-ended. Flip charts replaced flannel boards as the discussion's accompanying visual component. Dodger vindicated. Apologize, Steve. Thank you. Steve Garrison, it appears that you may have been familiar with the 1986 version called the Uniform System for Teaching the Gospel, which I suggested to you would be, something you might want to just consider, that perhaps I had a previous, a previous format, but you insisted that I was dishonest instead. Well, let's look and see. Here's an example of how leading these things are. By the way, here's the 1961. The elder says, I know that Joseph Smith did see the Father and Son. Yeah, that's nice. They're basically making you read a testimony as if it's yours. You're memorizing shit that you may not even believe. I know that Joseph Smith did see the Father and the Son. In fact, he could see them just as clearly as you can see Elder Jones and me. He could see that his own body truly was created in the image and likeness of God. At that time, the churches taught that God was only a spirit, that he had no body. But what do we learn about God from the experience of Joseph Smith? Mr. Brown said. The Mr. Brown response is supposed to be, that he had a real body? The elder says, yes, he does. The churches also taught that God the Father and Jesus Christ, his Son, were both the same being. But what did Joseph Smith see? Brown says, he saw 2 personages in the form of men. That's what you're supposed to guide him to say. And then there's a number 2 there. The Father and Son have bodies. Continuing, of course, says the elder, that is true. God does have a body. He is a real God, and he made us to be like him. From what we have said here, Mr. Brown, why was Joseph Smith a prophet? Brown's supposed to say, because he saw and spoke with the Father and the Son. Elder says, so what are the teachings of the prophet Joseph? What are the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith so important? That obviously is supposed to say why. Brown says, because his teachings come directly from God. 3. Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. Yes, that's the conclusion we're supposed to lead them to. This is a sales presentation, and I want to make a very strong point here, by the way, on this specific topic. Elder says, I'm sure they do. In the grove of trees that day, Joseph Smith asked the Savior which of the churches he should join. Joseph was told he should join none of them. Why do you suppose Jesus told him that? Like it's a fact, right? Brown, they must not have been teaching the truth. Elder, exactly right. Okay, now we jump to what was being taught in 86 right there. And here's the 73. But I want to, which would have been what I was using. Okay, so let's look at this here. This relates to a discussion I had with my bishop, who was pretty much familiar with church apologetics and gave me like the Doubt Your Doubts article from Jeffrey Holland, I believe. Something like that. Okay, it was something like that. Anyway, maybe I'm confusing that with Dieter Uchtdorf's quote, but I know that Joseph Smith did see the Father and the Son. Okay, he says, but what do we learn about God from the experience of Joseph Smith? That he had a real body. Okay, so he's making a big deal. This is the discussions. This is the church's official discussions telling us that we learned from the first vision that Joseph Smith made up in 1838, published in 1842, that God the Father had a body of flesh and bones, and that Joseph Smith learned that from the first vision. Now, when I discussed this issue with the bishop, because Joseph Smith taught in the Book of Mormon, which wasn't necessarily Joseph Smith, teaches that Jesus Christ and God the Father are the same person, which point is also made here and said to be erroneous, but that's what's in the Book of Mormon. But Joseph Smith in Lecture 5 in the Lectures on Faith that he taught in the School of the Prophets said that God was a spirit, and he differentiated him, saying that Jesus had a resurrected, glorified body. And he only stated that the Holy Ghost was merely the combined mind and will of God and Christ. Now, of course, that all changed with section 130, where God the Father caught up with Jesus in the new LDS plan of salvation and exaltation that Joseph Smith was teaching from the time he was teaching basically the King Follett discourse, that God the Father became a God by progressing and was once a man that lived on another planet. So, we can clearly see here that the 1961 discussions were stating, like my bishop said when he said, I know that we teach in Sunday school, basically, that Joseph Smith learned that God the Father and Jesus Christ were separate and distinct and had resurrected bodies from that first vision. But it simply isn't true, Dave. Joseph Smith's knowledge or testimony of God, understanding, I believe was the word he used, evolved over time. That was his excuse for this contradiction. So we see it right here. Officially, the church was stating that Joseph Smith learned this at that time, that he supposedly had the first vision. But that, of course, isn't what he was teaching early on. That's not what he was teaching in the School of the Prophets. And they are dishonestly misstating the case here. If he did learn that in a first vision, if it had actually happened, he wouldn't have taught that God was just a spirit like the Christians teach, whom they are mocking in this discussion for being wrong. Alrighty. LDS Church, not true. Alright, Steve, you've got some apologizing to do. Here's the 1973 ones. Missionary, Mr. and Mrs. Brown, suppose you put yourselves in the position of this young man, Joseph Smith. Picture yourself as Joseph Smith, struggling to know the truth about religion. As you're reading the Bible, you read the promise in James 1:5. Never has any scripture touched your heart so deeply. Having faith, you do as James directs and go to the grove of trees near your father's farm. Kneeling in prayer, you plead for guidance from your Father in heaven. This is your first uttered prayer. With all your heart, you want to know the truth. Visualize the feeling when in answer to your prayers a light descends from heaven, and within that light you see two glorious personages, the Father and the Son. Mr. Brown! Could you ever be the same after that experience? Brown response. Okay, people. Yeah. Sometimes I just like to gloat because life's hard enough. Once in a while I just gotta say, you pro-Mormon apologists, gotta be careful when you put yourself out on that shit. All right, Steve. Apologize. Thank you very much. You're welcome. You've been schooled, and now you know you've been lied to by your church leaders as well. Oh, and while I'm doing this, I got a text message or two from Kristi Brown, whom I interviewed yesterday regarding her documentary film on the institutionalized practice within the church of covering up for pedophilia within the priesthood ranks. And so I'm going to be publishing that later today, hopefully. I've been working on the editing, mostly just clearing way too much data out of my phone. So I brought up the subject here with Kristi. So Kristi says, hi, hey, it's Kristi. This is just a few minutes ago. Did you need to redo anything from yesterday or need me to finish the interview, or is it all okay? Let me know. I can work around my schedule. You always have been so kind to me from the beginning. Yeah, see, my data just like completely used up and it shut off I had to stop recording, so I might have to make do, or she's volunteering to be even more helpful and get some additional moments in. So I say, hey, Kristi, thanks for getting back to me. I've been working hour after hour on dealing with the fact that I overdosed my phone on data by using the camera, looking at the temple and me back and forth. So I mean, in editing, and finally been able to erase the original recording to get some room, although it's not that much room, to let me see where I'm at. And I would actually, I would like to do a little wrapping up or something. And if we don't manage to do that together, at least I will pitch your gig again. I did put the trailer into the video so far. And after a long night, I just decided to respond to some twit. Oh, sorry, Steve, who was calling me a liar in my comments section. So I'm putting together, actually I already did, I'm just going to publish this response to him showing that yes, we did memorize discussions back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, and Mr. Brown was part of them, despite him calling me a liar. Says Kristi, I had to memorize our discussions on my mission as well. That's right, girl missionary back there in the day. People can be stupid. Oh, sorry, Steve, that was just... It was, it was deserved. Sorry. You can't assume that everyone did everything at the same time as you and you know all truth and it never changed, because Jesus' truth always changes in the LDS church, Steve. All right, just thought I'd rub that in. I mean, I got, third-party confirmation just like that. It must have been the Spirit, Steve. Okay, this time I'm really out. Waiting for that apology, Steve. That humble apology.